People often ask me what the best near-death experience story I've ever encountered is. It's a tough question because there are so many extraordinary accounts and cases. But the one I'm going to share with you today, if it's not the very best, is definitely among the greatest. It involves not just one, but several extraordinary elements that even challenge our current understanding of what life after death might be like. I ask for your patience because this is a somewhat longer story, but every moment is worth it. The deeper we go into the narrative, the more incredible things happen. Plus, the author is very detailed, which makes everything richer and more profound. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, I'm referring to NDEs, or near-death experiences. In this case, it's about Peter Scott, who had a motorcycle accident, and upon seeing himself outside his own body, far from the crash site, experienced magnificent, indescribable events that unveiled a reality we barely understand. This case is cosmic in scope, truly advanced. So don't just focus on the account itself. Pay close attention to the analysis I'll offer afterwards, because there are many things you might find unbelievable, but my interpretation will give you a fresh perspective that you probably haven't considered. So folks, let's not waste any more time. This is an extraordinary, magnificent story. And Peter begins his testimony like this. I had this experience on Friday, August 10th, 1974, 5 days before my 20th birthday. I had finished work for the weekend and was out on the street chatting with a friend. I had a motorcycle that, at the time, was one of the things that gave meaning to my life because it allowed me to get out of my usual environment and get around. We were discussing what we might do over the weekend. It was just before dusk, and the sun was still shining beautifully. We lived in Edinburgh, Scotland, which isn't exactly one of the sunniest places in the world, but that made us appreciate the sun even more when it showed up. He suggested we grab a tent and a backpack with tools and head north on the bike to camp. My friend thought it was a good idea. He went home to get his things while I prepared the tent, tools, and the motorcycle. In less than half an hour, we were heading north. As we rode up the road, my friend and I noticed a large grassy area to our right that looked like a park, with tents set up, like a fair being prepared for the weekend. Communicating on a motorcycle can be a bit tricky. Sometimes, the challenge for the rider is that if they want to speak to the passenger, they first need to get their attention. So, I turned to ask my friend if he wanted to stop and take a look around. When I leaned my head, I noticed he was sitting there, watching the tents and the people. I looked back at the road, then tapped his knee to get his attention. Turning my head once more, we were both wearing full-face helmets. So, to be heard, I started shouting and asked if he wanted to check it out. He shouted back and nodded yes. I turned my head back to the road and, to my horror, saw that we were about to crash into the back of a stopped car. Many people who have been in an accident might recognize the feeling that everything seems to happen in slow motion the moment they realize the collision is unavoidable. What always amazes me about this is the sense of inevitability that comes with that realization. You clearly see what's going to happen, but there's absolutely nothing you can do about it because there simply isn't enough time. Yet, everything seems to unfold very slowly. My hands and feet moved to the brakes and gear levers. I managed to touch them just once while watching the motorcycle's front wheel begin to make contact with the car's rear bumper. I sat there, watching as the front wheel started to crumple on impact. You see, it really was in slow motion. I watched the wheel gradually deform, right? I felt the back of the motorcycle lift into the air. At the same time, I felt my own body being thrown forward over the handlebars. For my friend, that sudden movement turned the part of the motorcycle where he was sitting into a kind of ejector seat. When I felt the back of the motorcycle reach its highest point behind me, I saw my friend begin flying through the air. At that moment, the force of the motorcycle's movement and the impacts traveling through both the machine and my body started to lift me into a standing position while my head was violently pushed downward. I thought my face would smash into the back of the car and wondered if my helmet would hold up to the impact. Then, suddenly, and with great force, I saw the back of the car begin to pull away from me. However, it felt like some things no longer mattered to me, as if I was starting to disconnect from my normal consciousness. The injuries I suffered in that accident were fractures to my right wrist and right femur, though I didn't realize that at the time. I only felt my body being thrown backward and eventually separated from the motorcycle, landing on my back on the asphalt. I realized I had been thrown several meters away from the car. When I lifted my head after hitting the asphalt, a sharp pain ran through my entire body. This left me deeply confused. I couldn't understand what was causing such pain. Then, I started to notice that somehow I wasn't in a normal state of mind. My thoughts and my awareness of my body seemed clouded by a strange feeling, as if my mind was seeing my physical body as nothing more than an object. It was then that I felt a new sensation, as if deep inside me, I was freezing cold. I noticed my jaw beginning to tremble, apparently reacting to that intense cold inside me. I tried to stop it, but couldn't fully control the shaking. Somehow, I understood that these waves of confusion were a serious danger. I realized the coldness in my core was growing much stronger, and my jaw trembled almost uncontrollably. It was at that moment I noticed a smell inside the helmet that I couldn't place. Then I saw that my visor was down. That's when I recognized the smell I'd been picking up inside the helmet. Gasoline. Somehow I was breathing in fuel vapors, though I didn't know how. Then suddenly, my hand managed to lift the visor, and a rush of fresh air filled my helmet. I took a deep breath and immediately felt more able to resist the overwhelming urge to faint. That's when I suddenly noticed a quick movement near my head. Someone knelt beside me, and I heard words like, "We're nurses, step aside." In that moment, I saw a face coming closer. Then, I felt the wave of faintness wash over. I knew I couldn't hold on any longer. It was too strong, and it was at that point, as I would later learn, that I lost consciousness. But now I found myself in a dark, empty, pitch-black space. I couldn't see anything but darkness. However, even though I was aware of this, I didn't feel afraid. I also realized that I didn't have a body. I existed only as a consciousness. What really caught my attention was the nature of something more that was happening. I need to pause here and say that, over the years, after this experience, I've read various accounts of near-death experiences, or descriptions of this kind of state as a kind of void. I noticed many similarities between what I'm describing here and those accounts of the void. However, I don't use that term because I didn't experience that place as mere nothingness. On the contrary. Now continuing with my story, it seemed that somehow I had mentally asked a question. When, how, and why I asked it, I didn't know. But as I reflected on my emotions, I realized my question was about my family, the people I loved. I had asked as if I was worried about their future, as if there were some kind of barrier preventing me from helping them. The idea of that barrier, whatever it was, deeply saddened me. It felt like I wouldn't be there for them, and I didn't understand why those thoughts and feelings were coming up. Only that in that moment, they felt real. In a way, it seemed my emotions understood something my conscious mind couldn't clearly express. The moment I realized this, something happened that surprised me but didn't frighten me. What happened was that suddenly, a voice appeared. I didn't know where the voice was coming from, but I recognized it was something external to me. Yet, despite being external, she carried an authority, an understanding, and a kindness so powerful that they seemed to seep into me in a way I had never felt before. The presence of that voice around me, and somehow also within me, began to dissipate my sadness. It was then suddenly that the voice said, "It's okay, they will be fine. Nothing can hurt them. They can't even be touched." At the same time, I sensed the presence of a being very close to me, even though I couldn't see it due to the complete darkness of that place. Although it was clearly responding to my question, its answer didn't come to me as a simple understanding. Nothing like that. On the contrary, it felt as though I was receiving the essence of understanding, something far beyond ordinary word. The strangest part was that the voice was communicating directly with a part of me that already knew it was true. It was as if the voice was awakening an inner knowledge that I possessed but had been unaware of until that moment. It was clear that the being speaking was not just speculating or trying to convince me of anything. It simply knew. There was no room for doubt, uncertainty, or alternative possibilities. I repeat, it simply knew. Then there was something like a very brief pause. In ordinary life, we might call it a moment for reflection, and I seemed to be there, comparing my feelings of sadness with the understanding that the voice had given me. It was as if I was assessing these two things in a way best described as aligning frequencies. Then, all of a sudden, the dialogue ended. Although a faint residue of sadness still lingered, it felt as though I had fully accepted the understanding that had been communicated to me and its absolute validity as an answer. This acceptance was almost like a physical act, as if it were decisive for what would happen next. The moment I felt the truth of that response and accepted it, I had a sudden sensation of movement. It felt like I was turning to one side and simply beginning to ascend. And this sudden movement brought other changes. I no longer felt the presence of the being who had communicated with me, but that didn't concern me either. The darkness began to gradually turn to white. It was still dark, but this absence, if it can be called that, felt formless. It seemed that the acceptance of movement began intensely, and somehow caused or created something we would understand as a structure around me in that so-called void. In other words, the act of turning, although I was not concerned with whether I still had a body, seemed to take on a certain physical form I was unaware of while receiving that telepathic response. At the same time, I began to rise. The perception of a sound and its generation also began. The emergence of something around me. All of this felt intensely connected to me, and at first it was just that sound. But as my upward movement continued, the sound grew louder. It had a rhythm, a periodic beat. At first, it reminded me of helicopter blades beginning to spin, which, by analogy, is the closest way I can describe it. There was a low energy component and a high energy component in all of that, and as I moved upward, the sound intensified, and the silence between each burst of energy grew shorter. At some point, I realized something had formed around me. This space was composed of individually arranged metallic rings, not in a spiral, but spaced equidistantly and also translucent. I say they were translucent because they emitted light. Although it resembled a tunnel of light, it wasn't exactly as others described. My feeling was that these were not rings of light themselves, but luminous containers passing through some kind of energy membrane. Even though I hadn't seen any membrane, I was inside the central region of these rings of light, constantly moving upward. And yes, I was accelerating rapidly. As my speed increased, the rings of light seemed closer together and glowed more brightly. My speed reached a level that, here on Earth, most people would consider simply incredible. It was absolutely phenomenal. As I ascended, I had a strong feeling that all the events I was witnessing were synchronized with that sound. I emphasized that this sound source was definitely external, but it also seemed to resonate within me. As I began to move faster, this internal vibration intensified significantly, to the point that at certain moments I felt everything might collapse somehow if the sound grew louder and the beat became more intense. Up until then, my reaction to all these events was one of very relaxed and slightly abstract observation. I wasn't disturbed by any of it. I was simply there, watching these incredible phenomena. However, there came a moment when the fading effect became so rapid that I realized I was starting to feel fear about what was happening. My fear was based on the fact that if everything continued as it was, with the energies increasing in intensity, everything would truly be in danger and could collapse. I might even explode. My fear grew as the sound escalated to speeds and levels that are absolutely indescribable here. Then suddenly, my fear vanished completely, and I no longer cared about the collapse. I seemed to accept it with a kind of indifference, as if I had reached a point of silence within myself. I only realized all this when suddenly it disappeared. I found myself floating in cosmic space. I was aware that somehow my state had changed. although I couldn't pinpoint when it happened. And I was there in complete peace, without any fear or worry. I felt enormous, as if I had become gigantic. Although that wasn't my focus, I noticed I still had a kind of body. And for all intents and purposes, this body was similar to my physical body here. Yet my sense of peace and freedom was incredible, something I had never experienced in this state before. It truly felt like I had shed something that could only be described as a kind of weight. I experienced an extraordinary sense of wholeness within myself, a peace so overwhelming that, for some, it might even seem impossible. Compared to there, even the calmest people on earth are nothing more than beings struggling, pretending to feel a sense of harmony. I also noticed that I seemed to have lost track of time. Everything had a magnificent feeling that couldn't be easily described. I started to look around, and as I did, I realized something about the space around me. There are, so to speak, close distances, I say. Close. In relation to cosmic standards, I noticed there were lights. I knew these lights were stars. In other words, here on Earth, we call them stars. Their colors were more varied than I had ever seen in an ordinary sky. But there, these stars were something more. They were also fully conscious beings. In fact, the entire universe, in which I was now lucid and beginning to observe, was fully and completely aware. I mean, everything, including space itself, was suffused with consciousness. There was nothing there that wasn't conscious, and that didn't seem surprising to me in some way. My feeling now was that I was at home and completely safe. Every burden I had ever carried simply vanished. And indeed, in many ways, it was only there, feeling this state, that I realized how overwhelmed I had been. Now I was in space, amidst the cosmos, among these beings whom I seemed to know so well, and this feeling was so vivid. I definitely felt that I knew these beings, and that I had known them for a long time. A very long time indeed, although I couldn't say exactly when. For all intents and purposes, we could say that I had known these stars for such vast periods that it could even be called eternity. Looking around, I saw that all these stars, or rather, those beings, were communicating with one another. And there were no words that could adequately describe everything happening there. We don't even have a vocabulary that comes close, not by a long shot, to explain what I'm trying to describe here. The communication was a direct transfer of thoughts and feelings, but there it truly became one. And it's difficult, because many people wouldn't understand or would doubt that words are unnecessary for thinking. That wasn't the case there. There, all of this happened simultaneously, and there wasn't even a need for translation. I realized that my ability to perceive nuances, shades, or degrees of affection had greatly expanded. It became necessary for me to understand their system of communication. I felt this was not just a personal need, but something relevant to the context I was in it. It's important to understand that, within such a communication system, it's entirely possible for another being to convey a message directly to you, without any ambiguity or imprecision whatsoever. And that's exactly what happened to me. Consequently, thought and feeling were no longer simply mine or yours. They became part of another being, yet still within me. Not only that, but I also knew I was doing the same with that other being. It was as if I held another mind and another complex set of emotions, while still being able to recognize that I was an individual entity. To simplify, I wrote this as if I were communicating with just one of these beings. However, I must say that in reality, there was intense communication happening among all the nearby stars I could see. Indeed, each of them was in this state of communication with one another, which is truly hard to describe in detail. Nevertheless, I knew and could deeply feel within myself everything that was unfolding in that space. There were literally hundreds of stars communicating with one another without any conflict, and I was there, perceiving it all in my intimate awareness. Now, I need to share something else. While I was in that space, in this conscious, thinking universe, feeling everything completely alive, I was filled with other intense thoughts. Looking around, I could literally see one of those stars, and know that its thoughts and feelings were already inside me. Not because I had just arrived, but because in some way I had already been there. The complication is that since I was also within myself, I was in some way within them as well. I know this concept is hard to grasp, but that's what was happening. It's essential to recognize that I wrote primarily about this topic focusing on the individual stars, that is, those beings. However, what was happening there was not what we understand as a linear communication system. This, in itself, was made even more complicated by the fact that I had no sense of time there. The temporal framework, if it even exists, is completely different from that of our planet, to the point that, for me, it made no sense to think about time at all. Something happened that nullified the way we understand the passage of time. However, as I observed all this and identified the communication among them, this whole experience had an indescribable quality. This is because all the communications produced only harmony. There was no deviation that could be interpreted as a miscommunication. And to describe all this, I can only think of one analogy, although it is quite imperfect. Being there, lying down, feeling, thinking, participating, and being transformed by each of those individualities was like everything being played as a highly complex piece of music, orchestrated simultaneously by millions of people or millions of objects. I had the ability to perceive the whole, while at the same time being aware of very individual aspect. But I'd like to return to something I mentioned earlier. My sense of self had expanded, and this expansion was unfamiliar to me. Part of this growth, this personal expansion, was connected to the fact that my ego had dissolved. However, what replaced the ego was a kind of unity with that so-called total mind. In fact, I had become part of those beings, and I must say that, in describing this, I truly felt like a beginner in that communication system. It really felt like I was being reintroduced by them to this new form, or a return to a more advanced kind of communication. It seemed as though I was rediscovering something in this process, and it was all very immediate. I had an awareness of something I didn't fully understand, and it had to do with some distant stars. At first, it seemed that I could only feel, participate in, know, and communicate with nearby stars. It was as if those distant stars were somehow blocked from my access and knowledge, or as if there was some kind of barrier preventing me from understanding what those distant stars were communicating. However, when I realized this, it didn't capture my interest for long, because that place carried a sense of perfection. Everything was as it should be. There was a purpose, and things were exactly right. But now I need to describe something more specific about what the stars were communicating to me. Essentially, it was something, even if I put it in simple quotation marks. Although I said the system was incredibly advanced, the first part of the message they conveyed to me was about the fact that they knew me and wanted me to know that they already knew me. The second part of their communication was that they let me know they were happy to see me again. They were truly, deeply happy to be back and to connect with me once more. The third part of the message was that they made it clear they loved me very much. I want to stress here that what I described as the first, second, or third part of the communication isn't accurate at all, since there was no linear sequence. The flow of language and knowledge was simultaneous. It all happened at once, yet everything was structured and understandable. This music had an organization that was simply indivisible. At that moment, I felt an overwhelming joy to be back in their presence. There, within that collective mind where I found myself, I was simply a loved individual. I was wrapped in the energy of love. I can't even begin to describe what it felt like to be in an environment like that, to experience that essence or base frequency. It's important to point out that these communications couldn't be separated between what was truly mine and what belonged to others. It reached a point where we were united. Yet, the precise flow carried thoughts and feelings that revealed the intentions and deeper meanings of everything, with remarkable subtlety. This entire sequence was initiated by a single star. It was the star I gazed at when I realized where I was and what was happening to me. I looked at that star, and it communicated to me, and to the others as well, something that could be translated as, "Look, he is here now. He's back with us. He's here once again." As I gazed at that star, the origin of everything, I realized that all the nearby stars already knew I was there. They already had received all the messages sent. I don't know how long I remained there, drifting in that region of space where I found myself. It could have been minutes, or it could have been forever. I didn't know, and I didn't mind. The feelings of being welcomed, of being loved, of being home, of feeling at peace, nourished, caressed, and accepted, as well as my love for them and their presence within me. Somehow, all of this made me sense the vastness of knowledge and the fundamental nature of existence. I was among those beings embraced and loved. For how long? I don't know. Then, amid all that harmony, I heard a low sound, like a distant rumble. I looked to my right, toward the direction from which the sound seemed to come. The way hearing worked there was similar to ours. However, this auditory perception wasn't limited to just that. Surprisingly, I also sensed the sound within me. It was as if some vibrational quality of the sound was moving inside, too. I focused on where I thought the sound was originating, and at first saw nothing. That area was distant, a dark part of space, without nearby stars. But then, I thought I caught a brief change in that region, as if something had appeared for a moment and then vanished. It felt like I had vaguely detected a point moving in that space, flickering in and out. That point kept appearing and disappearing, yet there was something shimmering about it. It was something different. It didn't involve light in the usual sense. It was simply the recognition that something distinct from the general background of space was present there. At that moment, I knew for certain that its persistence was because it was approaching. I sensed something was moving, seemingly heading in my direction. I don't know how long this lasted. Remember, time doesn't exist there as we understand it here. Just as I identified the movement, I suddenly felt a silence fall over me. And this had nothing to do with fear. In fact, I wasn't afraid at all there. It was just that, as this silence settled over me, I noticed that all the stars, hundreds of them, also fell silent. It was as if the entire space had been filled with this silence, creating a feeling that something profound was about to happen, even though I didn't know what now. It was as if all the stars had withdrawn into a state of contemplation, just as I had. The object I could now see, hear, and feel within me was getting closer, and as it approached, the feeling of sound grew stronger, until I felt my insides vibrate with it. Even when the object reached me, the sound never became too loud like I described in the ring tunnel. It simply increased in volume, but never overwhelmed me. And as I watched, the object began to come closer. As it drew nearer, I started to realize what was moving toward me. What was arriving was a rock rolling slowly, almost as if it were drifting through space, though its rate of rotation was very slow and didn't indicate its actual speed of movement. The rock was roughly spherical, and as it got closer, I saw that its surface was rough and irregular, like a huge rock you'd find here on Earth. The path it followed toward me traced a large arc. When the rock was halfway to me, I noticed some of its properties. Some surprised me. One thing I realized was that it wasn't fixed in any one point in space. It seemed I had an awareness of this rock as a distinct entity that somehow set it apart from everything around me. I knew this rock had a freedom of movement that distinguished it from other things. I also realized that I didn't perceive this rock the same way I did the stars. I was aware, too, that somehow the awareness of this rock wasn't being shared with me. My feeling was that something was approaching that was impossible to fully understand or describe, related to the state it was in. I had the sensation that this rock and its movement were incredibly deliberate. Whatever it wasn't just some random object drifting by on a random path. That rock had intention or will. I also sensed that this rock was timeless. I mean, by our standards, it was ancient, far beyond anything we could imagine. It might even be older than the universe itself. Now, all this apparent silence was actually a form of communication from it to me. I just didn't understand the language. so I assumed there was no communication at all. Whatever was happening in that moment was somehow meant to be. I knew why I was there, even though at that time I truly didn't understand, and that explained why the object had willed. It was, so to speak, fulfilling a promise and had known, since what we would call the beginning of time, that it would be here to meet me now. In that moment, I didn't recognize that I was also meant to be there to find it. That realization within me was only starting to take shape. And I tried again, just as I had with the other stars, to connect with the consciousness of this object, to merge with it in a clear way, but I simply couldn't. All I managed was what I've already described, and I saw the object coming closer and closer. It got to the point where I realized there was nothing I could do to make its arrival happen sooner. Now it was so near that my entire field of vision was filled with the rough surface of that massive rolling rock. It was so close I thought I could reach out and touch it if I wanted. It loomed so near that it would roll in my direction. And then I looked up and down, seeing nothing but this enormous rock above and below me as it rolled straight toward me, until suddenly I found myself lying there, suspended, floating in nothing but light. All around me was only light. There was no spot without it. I knew there was light even further away, beyond what I could see. And this energy was incredibly intense, but somehow it didn't hurt my vision. This light had a unique quality that is impossible to fully describe in its scope and magnitude. And the unique quality of this energy was absolute love. This love was both completely boundless and infinitely vast in its reach. It had a presence through which I could feel, with every fiber of my being, flowing toward me, through me, touching every part of my existence. There wasn't a single part of me untouched by this love. Everything, down to my very core, was filled with this feeling. Until today, I have never experienced a sensation that even came close to this. The intensity and the freely given feeling from this being, without any reservation. This being, this light, was pure love. And within that pure love came the awareness of its intelligence and wisdom, for I was also immersed in that. The scale of its intelligence was indescribable. Perhaps we can even call it infinite. This intelligence and wisdom were so vast that nothing was beyond its reach. Here I am, trying and failing miserably to put into words the indescribable. I have no choice but to put my pen down and say that, in its vastness and unlimited power, this being was astonishing, both in strength and in beauty. No words can truly capture what this was. However, it must be said that it was capable of everything, and everything it gave me, everything it did, could be distilled down to its essential quality, which was poured out for me without a single reservation. This essence was truly absolute, pure, genuine love, and this indescribable beauty continued to flow intensely through every part of my being. I've written this so you can understand what I'm about to say next. I need to prepare you for the sensations that overcame me immediately after I entered that energy. What follows now is, initially, a regression back to the moment I encountered that light. I found myself lying down again, suspended, floating in nothing but light. I could see that my body was positioned lying at a 30 angle, as if I were lying on my front. Seeing myself this way, lying in the light, lasted only a moment. Perhaps just a fraction of a second. Suddenly and instantaneously, I felt myself bursting with that light. I was still trying to locate my sense of self, but in that state, I realized that more waves of love were flowing into and over me from every imaginable spatial direction. I began to notice that love was also rising from within me, radiating waves continuously, directed towards I didn't know who. Then, I felt the presence of a being with the power and magnitude I had described. What I'm trying to convey is that, as I found myself within the light, this explosion caused my size to expand, as if my form completely lost its human attributes. I simply vanished. I literally became a formless being of light, and as strange as it may sound, I remained completely merged with that being. I have no idea how long this lasted. It could have been 20 seconds, or it could have lasted millennia. Once I lost my form at a certain point. It closed off, and it was as if I returned to having an identifiable form outside of that being of light, as if I had been pushed out, even though I was still feeling the massive love and energy I had felt before. I find it extremely difficult to put all of this into words. Then it came to me. I knew that I was within this being, and it was within me. We were united in such a way that there was no sense of separation. I know it's hard to understand, but as I delved deeper into that being, a sense of reverence arose within me. I also felt my own gratitude for being there, united with it again. I have to say this was a very intense feeling of that experience. It truly felt as if a part of me already knew that rock, that being, or that place, as if I had been with it before. Suddenly, when I expressed or at least communicated my sense of reverence and gratitude, though it wasn't necessary, as it already knew, it thanked me for that by transmitting even more love. I surrendered to it because I wanted to remain open to it, to stay open in that state forever. We were absolutely connected, and a union like that can never be described as anything like what exists on Earth. It was love expressed without barriers. It wasn't common love, so to speak. The sensations I experienced were, at the same time, immensely powerful, yet incredibly light and subtle. Again, the only way to describe them here is through metaphors. It was as if an entire orchestra, made up of millions upon millions of instruments, was playing all at once. This was, so to speak, the ultimate form of communication, love. Or if you prefer, it was the living essence and harmony not just among the stars, but also with that being, culminating in eternal love. And after all of those overwhelming feelings, that was when I realized I was there for a kind of judgment. But judgment is a word I put in quotes. This became completely clear to me, and it didn't worry me at all. And when I say judgment in quotes, I mean there was no possibility of condemnation involved. I felt so calm, so nourished, so wrapped up and enchanted by everything, that I knew this being would never do anything to harm me. I knew this being wasn't human. It was infinitely beyond our level. I understood that the powerful being was the one who would judge me, but honestly, I embraced it. I embraced it because I knew I was in the presence of absolute love. That being was completely benevolent. To be judged by that consciousness means being exposed to its total love for you. As that being, that light united with me in love, I returned my love to it to deepen our connection. And then I realized that in that profound connection, it was searching for something within me. In other words, it was sensing my path through itself, looking for something in its judgment of me. You have to understand, this wasn't simply the being analyzing me from the outside. I was being examined at the very core of my being. I tried to describe it above as a kind of judgment, but really it was deeply tied to my own expression and the way I acted in my lives. After living through this experience, I read other accounts of the dying process where people review images or scenes from their lives as a kind of life review. That didn't happen to me. However, I knew that I was, so to speak, being judged, or rather, that I was part of something similar. But that wonderful being was completely searching through me. It was there looking for something, evaluating, sensing vibrations, frequencies, and emotions, absorbing them with its love, getting to know me entirely. And surprisingly, this didn't feel invasive at all. On the contrary, I was happy that this being was observing me in that way. I embraced it and loved it back. That's why I knew that this whole judgment process was something I needed to go through, and the foundation of everything that happened contained the answer to just one question. You see, understand that everything was based on, all judgment, all the scrutiny, every analysis of me was based on a single question. Pay close attention. Here's the question behind the judgment. What is the essence of your love? I'll repeat it. What is the essence of your love? Of course, love here means, brotherly love. Or, to put it more simply, what is the vibration or frequency that your love resonates? Wave after wave. I realized this being was encircling and analyzing me because of that. Then, there was what I can only describe as a pause. Suddenly, it became clear that this so-called judgment had ended. I knew I was still connected to that being, still immersed in the light. But then, Everything fell silent. The waves of love flowing around and through me stopped. All became calm. I was lying there in that energy, in that absolute peace and stillness that remained. Yet in that silence of feeling, I realized it could only be described as total acceptance. Then suddenly, something else happened. Before I knew it, I found myself gazing into that dark universe, at the celestial stars. As I realized this, I turned my head to the left. At that moment, I saw that the rock was now directly to my left, no longer at arm's length. It was slowly rolling away from me, drifting off into space, and I stood there watching it move farther away. Yet, I was still energetically connected. It was still communicating with me, but in a much softer and more subdued way. In a way, her mode of communication was similar to when she first started approaching. That system of communication and interaction was gradually fading away. As that rock that being moved a considerable distance from me, she conveyed a message that, if translated into words, might be something like, "I will see you, I will meet you again later." Again, I must stress that this attempt at verbal translation falls short. The communication contained many elements expressing love and reference time within this context. It was clear in the message that we would meet again later, which was a significant reference to time. We, as human beings, simply don't think in such time frames. We just don't. But that being was saying we would see each other again after an immense stretch of time. And I knew that the concept of time it referred to meant absolutely nothing to that being. Nothing. Such a short span of time was irrelevant to it, though to us it could mean thousands or even millions of years. It's a reference with a very different meaning for that consciousness. I looked at her, and she communicated this way. However, I felt the urge to follow her, and in fact, I made a small movement to do so while thinking and sensing that the being was abandoning me. Then I realized that she completely understood what she was doing and knew she was not abandoning me. I knew that she, or he, had said she would find me later. Now, when later would actually be is another matter, but I was certain everything was fine and in order. As soon as I realized this, I saw her trajectory beginning to arc toward the side of a small planet that was now close by. I found it curious because I hadn't noticed that planet before. However, I knew I had looked in that direction when I arrived here, but I hadn't taken the time to understand how that planet had come to be there. Then I chose to look at the rock and saw that it had moved much farther away from me. That's when I decided to turn my gaze elsewhere. I looked up and saw the starry sky above me. I noticed that the nearby stars had somehow disappeared. None of them were there anymore. I also realized that the space I was in was no longer filled with consciousness. Everything was silent, just like when I arrived. All I could see were those distant stars out there, in that vast infinity. I couldn't feel any connection to them. As I was turning my head, I thought I needed to decide where to go next. That's when I noticed a spot in the sky, surrounded by distant stars, and suddenly I felt drawn to head in that direction. It didn't feel like a firm decision about where I truly wanted to go. I just wanted to move toward that place. I didn't know if it would be a long journey or a short one, but I started to move. Suddenly, as I began to move and fly, something happened. I heard a woman's voice calling my name. It sounded like my grandmother's voice, the woman I used to live with back then. It seemed like she was telling me to get up and go to work. I remember murmuring something like, "I'm not going to work. I don't feel well." But as I said this, I opened my eyes, and at first I was disoriented as I realized where I was. I noticed I was inside an ambulance, and suddenly that pain, though still much reduced, came back. I started to realize I had been in an accident. I was taken to Bridget O'Verne Hospital, treated, and although I was still in mild medical shock, I was placed in a bed. I spent the next day and a half feeling almost numb, quite unwell, and refusing to eat much. By the middle of the second day, one of the nurses asked why I wasn't eating. I told her I didn't feel like it because I was experiencing constant nausea and persistent headaches. I even mentioned a strange smell that seemed to be lingering around me, but I couldn't identify it. The nurse then opened my bedside cabinet, and as she did, The smell of gasoline vapor spread. My clothes had been put in a plastic bag, but it hadn't been sealed properly. I had been lying there exposed to a constant release of gasoline fumes. She took the clothes to be incinerated. Later that day, I began to recover, but during that time, I chose not to share my near-death experience with anyone because I worried they might think I was crazy. I didn't have a clear framework to make sense of it all. Yet, I was absolutely certain that what I had experienced was completely real. What an incredible story. Now, I want to point out a few details you might not have noticed or considered while listening. There's also an interesting analysis to explore. The first point is about the stars. The stars were conscious. That is, they had conscious beings within them. This goes beyond our current understanding. Why? Because we don't really know what exists once the cycle of reincarnation ends. However, I've come across several accounts on this channel of people who, at this cosmic level, sense the presence of conscious beings living inside stars. What stood out to me most in this story is the following. In a treatise about out-of-body experiences, the author Valdo Vieira mentions 3 things that I've never forgotten, which left a deep impression on me and are reflected in this account. The first is simply this: there are conscious beings existing within the intense heat of suns. This aligns perfectly with many accounts I've heard over the years here on the channel, and in this story it happens again. So you see, there are highly evolved beings. That star, that sun, represents a new kind of body that someone inhabits for a certain, or maybe an indefinite, period of time. How that works exactly is another matter. Another detail: the rock. The rock was large, obviously huge as described, but it wasn't just a rock. There was a being inside it. Could it be that when we stop reincarnating, among other things, we have the option to choose a kind of object, perhaps an inanimate, physical one, through which we manifest ourselves, wandering or flowing through the universe as a whole? That being inhabiting, so to speak, inside that rock was a deeply evolved consciousness. It wasn't God. If you thought it was, calling God a stone might be a bit ironic, especially for some religious views. But no, it wasn't God. It was a highly evolved being who already knew God and had been close to him. That's another important point as well. Because what is the second thing that Valdo Vieira mentions in his book? That there are semi-material objects in the universe. What does semi-material mean? These objects are both physical and extra-physical. In other words, they exist between dimensions. Semi-material objects. This rock, or the being inhabiting this rock, wasn't entirely physical. Look at what he said. It moved with intention, with evolution. It's not like this rock was randomly floating through the cosmos. No, that's not it. Wherever in the universe it wanted to appear, it appeared. And the fact that it kept appearing and disappearing shows it could transition between dimensions. So see, it materialized and dematerialized at will. Apparently, that rock could show up in a nearby galaxy or in one on the other side of the universe. Any location, any environment. At its will it appears, especially since time flowed differently for it. So, what's its age, right? Since he mentioned that not even our wildest imagination could conceive this, he had this understanding. So, how does it work? We don't have any theory, not even a hypothesis, to explain a being in a rock performing this kind of role, welcoming people, assessing, and, providing guidance. Just to give you an idea of how serious this issue of material existence is, when he leaves the rock, pay attention. He says the rock goes to a planet. He says, wait a minute, this planet wasn't here. How did it appear? Then, suddenly, he asks, where are the stars that were talking? They're not there anymore. Look at what happened during the time he was inside, right? He said it could have been minutes or it could have been millennia. He doesn't know. Time doesn't flow like ours. But when he leaves the rock, he ends up in another part of space. That's what he understood. He was in another part of the universe, near a planet, and those stars weren't even there anymore. He was far from everything. So during that moment, that rock kept moving through the universe, kept jumping from place to place. He left a specific location, and he didn't notice that, you see? That's what's really interesting. So look, there are semi-material beings. So, See what he mentioned: conscious beings in the high temperatures of suns, semi-material object beings. And the third point was that there are micro and macro beings beyond our current understanding. In the universe, there exist entities so tiny and others so massive that they go beyond what we can comprehend. What you might not have noticed, and what became very clear to me, is that the tunnel of light he passed through wasn't really a tunnel at all. Those energy rings, which he described as having a sound and vibrating inside him, actually made him start to feel fear, because he sensed such an immense amount of energy and power that it felt like he might explode it, shatter into pieces, or literally die from the intense energy flowing through him. Here's my theory, my hypothesis. See if it makes sense. The tunnel of light is simply a dimensional passage, okay? In Ikshiem, during the out-of-body experience, passing through this tunnel means moving from one dimension to another. But in this state, my analysis is that something unprecedented happened, something I've never seen before. Those energy rings were filling him with energy, becoming more powerful, bigger, and more massive. When he comes out of this so-called tunnel, he realizes he still has a human shape, but he's gigantic. He says, "Wow, I'm huge. I'm enormous. How does that happen? And why was it done?" He was given so much energy so that he could be noticed by those hundreds of stars. Obviously, it's an enormous place where, if you know even a little about astronomy, you understand that the distances between stars are vast, okay? So in a place where hundreds of stars are close together, they all perceive his presence. Why? Because he carried an enormous amount of energy inside him, which allowed others to perceive him and empowered him to communicate with the stars around. Do you get it? So this so-called tunnel was like a capacitor or energy accumulator that enabled this entire experience. Maybe without it, he wouldn't have had enough energy to connect even to the very rock. Does that make sense to you? For me, it became very clear because it's completely different. He himself said, it's not the tunnel of light described in NDEs, but that sound, that energy kept increasing and increasing. And it was that for me that gave him the ability to do everything he did. So, this is a really fascinating place. A very serious matter, right? Another thing, that voice that appeared at the beginning, at the start of his account, it was very clear to me that it was his guide. I mean, his mentor, his guiding light, whatever you want to call it, an extra physical benefactor. The guide began by saying to him, "Hey, stay calm. You don't need to worry about your family. Everything's fine. They're okay. It's all right, you know? Just relax. Don't panic." Once he calmed down, this guide was responsible for that transitional dimension. You see, it wasn't an inhabited extra-physical community, nor was it a negative one. It was a community of transition, a transitional dimension. After calming him and having a conversation, he creates the tunnel, right? Those rings, those energy circles provided that advanced technology for him to reach that state, that new level of manifestation. So much so that after he spoke when he was there, that being who talked to him, he didn't notice anymore and was left behind. That one, right? I'm not one to bet, nor do I like to, but if I had to bet, I would say that first voice was indeed his guide, which is pretty cool too. Another thing, the judgment. I don't know if you touched on that, right? But this judgment that happened, in my understanding, he was found wanting. Look at the subtlety I'm going to point out here. When he arrives in the stars and everyone says, "Look, he's here, he's back, he's here again." Probably, those beings in the stars were people, beings who lived with Peter a long time ago, many lives ago. My hypothesis is that these beings continued to evolve, grow, and improve. And Peter was left behind. Left behind in what sense? He lived lives filled with bitterness, trauma, and violence. He continued to live out his immaturities instead of being responsible and deepening his evolutionary development. You understand? His friends moved on, and he was left behind. That's why, In my hypothesis, when he appears at that moment and the rock emerges, it was to make an assessment. What kind of assessment? They examined all of his last lives. When I say last, you can picture a huge list where that rock-like being could analyze. Has he matured enough to follow a higher evolutionary path, to level up, to rise and begin acting? Maybe even reach a cosmic level like his friends. But what happens? That being of pure peace who would never condemn him said nothing but pay attention. When the judgment ended, he soon found himself outside the rock. So the rock didn't say, "Oh, my friend, you failed. You're still more immature than mature." It simply didn't say anything. Once the judgment was over, he found himself in space, and the rock said, "Oh, we'll meet again after some time." That means it gave him more time, whether thousands or millions of years, for Peter to keep evolving life after life, growing, maturing, helping others. The question was also powerful, right? What is the essence of your love? So he would keep seeing. If he evolved, who knows how long it would take. The rock would return, conduct a new judgment, and see if the being had evolved. If he had, great. Let's move on to a new level. If not, absolute patience. You return, and in a few thousand years we'll meet again. Who knows, by then he might have matured even more and faced new evolutionary challenges. You understand? To me, it makes perfect sense. And to me, that's what happened. Peter failed. He didn't pass the test, and maybe in a few thousand years, he'll have a new evaluation and hopefully be able to move forward. It all makes sense. In fact, his life review didn't even happen. He only felt the being rummaging through him. It wasn't a normal life review like in completely atypical cases, you know. This existential rummaging at the core, in the essence of the being, is another very serious point. Now, what does it achieve? I think one of the most profound things ever mentioned is, in fact, the question, what is the essence of your love? Let's remember, love, synonymous with fraternity, compassion, and helpfulness. It's about being kind and brotherly toward others. So this brings us to a question I often ask about near-death experiences, which is basically, what have you done on Earth for others? Now, considering this context, when we think about multiple planets, that question might seem a bit outdated. Perhaps a more fitting question is, what have you done on your planet for others? Do you see what I mean? In other words, what is the essence of your fraternal love? Because it doesn't help if, I've said this before, and I'll say it again, the universe is subtle. The essence of the cosmos is fraternity. It's about helping others. So if you can dedicate your time, your energy, your efforts to the well-being of others, to enlighten, to assist, to do what's positive for other people, that's what truly matters. The most evolved beings who are reborn do exactly that all the time. They help, they repair, you know. They provide ideas, inspiration, energy. It's a complete giving. They reach the peak of evolution, personal maturity, and balance, and from there on, it's just giving, 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 until they feel they have given enough and stop being reborn, you understand? That's why those stars were beings who, at that level, had zero negative thoughts. Everything was advanced. Everything was wonderful. Everything was incredible. Why? Because they were highly evolved beings manifesting in those celestial bodies. Do you get it? So, it's an extraordinary experience. There are many things we can't fully express. Truly, it's the evolved beings who connect in stars when they stop being reborn. What is that rock? What tunnel is that? What message was conveyed? What kind of judgment was that? What does it mean to meet every few thousand years? Peter, in fact, was a failure, right? In thousands of years, he'll return to the stars. Oh, he went back for a new judgment. How does that work? I mean, did he not connect to those other stars because they weren't beings from his evolutionary group? Anyway, there are many open questions, an extraordinary experience, and a detail. If you want to learn how to have extraordinary out-of-body experiences safely, without accidents or trauma, right from the comfort of your home, pay close attention. I'm recording this video just before the channel hits 100K subscribers as a special event, but an out-of-body experience course will be launching soon. By the time you're watching this, the course might already be available for you to join. So I'll explain everything in an easy-to-understand way, but with deep, meaningful content, okay? Everything you need to know to have out-of-body experiences. What holds you back? What helps? What to do? What not to do? Tips, techniques, and an in-depth exploration of the subject. In the course, there will be 2 different formats, which I'll explain when we launch it. So, if you're wondering, Alexandra, how do I do this? Can I do it at home? Is there any danger? What's recommended? What might happen to me? What phenomena can trigger these experiences? If something unusual happens, what should I do? What shouldn't I do? You know? Everything will be covered for you. I started teaching out-of-body experience courses back in 2003, so I bring considerable experience, but this new course is honestly the most comprehensive one available, no doubt about it. And another important point, this course isn't just from one author. I've included contributions from the leading voices in the out-of-body experience field. So you'll find William Buman, Robert Monroe, Valdo Vieira, Wagner Borges, and Susan Blackmore, among others. It features all the most relevant perspectives. It's a complete, universal course that discusses various authors. I take the best from each to give you the best content possible. So keep an eye on the channel. We'll talk more about this in other videos, and also on the Dimensa Mental Instagram, where dates and formats will be shared. If you want, in the first pinned comment on this channel, there's a Learn More link you can check out. If the course is available, you can sign up and start having your own experiences. You might even have experiences like Peter's. It's rare for something at that level to happen, but it can occur. Why not? It's impossible to say you won't have such experiences. You could have amazing encounters, reconnect with relatives, or even see where you were before being born. You might lose your fear of death, you know. You could visit beautiful local communities and gain advanced knowledge. There's so much to explore outside the body. Imagine experiencing something like this. You can step out into the universe. You can leave your body, see Earth from afar, visit the sun, explore a black hole, go wherever you want. There are many stories on this channel. I'm talking about people who have traveled to the cosmos, to more advanced intelligent planets, and yes, who have visited black hole. It's all here. This experience is extraordinary, but theory alone isn't enough. You need to take the theory and put it into practice. So, I sincerely invite you to seize this opportunity as well. If you enjoyed this content, please like the video and subscribe. Thank you so much to everyone. As I record and publish this video, we've surpassed 100,000 subscribers. It's incredibly rewarding to reach this milestone, and I'm counting on you to help us hopefully hit the next 1,000,000 subscribers. Did someone come to mind? Share this video with anyone or any group who might find it meaningful. Once again, thank you so much. I'm truly grateful for this first milestone of 100,000 subscribers here on the channel. I'm Alexander Perry, sending you a big hug and the best cosmic energies. Until next time, thank you.